last week, Kathy started the conversation on God's covenants, and we reviewed three of those covenants with Noah and with Abraham and with Moses, or sometimes it's called the covenants for Israel. And we're going to, what I thought that I would do to start out with is to, if I can, I'll try to play a short video. It's 8 minutes long, and it reviews the covenants that Kathy studied last week, and then it introduces the two covenants that we'll be talking about today with King David and the New Covenant. And then it also makes us aware of three other covenants that are in the Bible. When you look up covenants in the Bible, sometimes it says 5, sometimes it says 7, sometimes it says 8, sometimes it says 9. And so lots of different covenants in the Bible and ways of interpreting that. And this particular video, like I said, if I can play it, introduces three new covenants. One was Eden, which is the creation story, the Adam covenant, the covenant with Adam, and it also later mentions Palestine, a covenant with Palestine. So these are the 8 covenants that they're going to be mentioning in this video. So let me see first if I can play it. I'm going to share my screen. Okay, and let me get this one up. Oh, shoot.
Do you know what a covenant is? A covenant is a contract or an agreement. In the Bible, covenants are made between God and his people. There are 8 covenants in the Bible.
That?
Understanding these covenants is the key to understanding the entire meta-narrative of God's purposes and ultimate will for his people. Let's take a look. The Edenic Covenant. The key word here is the word rule. In Genesis 2:15, right after God had created man, he put him in the garden and told him to care for it. From the very beginning, God's eternal purpose for man was to rule and enjoy him forever. Psalm 8 says, "You make him to rule over the works of your hands. You've put all things under his feet." David was saying, you've made something from nothing. You're powerful, and you've made man ruler over your creation to show your glory. But man rebelled and forsook his position. We all know the story. Adam ate from the tree that God told him not to eat and brought sin into the world. The penalty for sin was death because God would not let man live eternally in his sin, so man lost it. We will need a second Adam to reclaim God's original purpose for man to rule, but only after he redeems man from his sin, which brings us to the next covenant. Number 2 is the Adamic Covenant. The chief word here is the word redemption. So because of Adam's sin, God curses man, animals, and the earth so it will yearn for his redemption. So immediately after sin occurs, God tells us how he will deal with it. Genesis 3:15, God reveals his unconditional covenant and his curse upon the serpent by saying, "I will put enmity between you and your seed," meaning Satan, "and the woman's seed," meaning Jesus. "He will crush your head and you will strike his heel." Satan will inflict minor damage on Christ through crucifixion, but Christ will inflict major damage on Satan by defeating the curse of death. Jesus is the only one who can accomplish this because he will be born of the Holy Spirit, incarnated, going around the curse, born without man's sin. As time went on, man's newfound sin deteriorated into a sick and depraved wasteland of evil until every intent and thought on his heart was wicked. And God said, "I will wipe from the face of the earth the human race I have created." And that took place in Genesis 6, verse 7. Number 3 is called the Noahic Covenant. The key word here is the word restraint. This covenant shows an attribute of God that we can be grateful for, and that is his restraint. For instead of blotting out the entire human race, he preserved Noah and all the animals in the ark and restrained his wrath, partly because of his mercy, but also partly because of his covenants, which he cannot change. Then in Genesis 8:21, God makes a covenant that he will never again destroy all living creatures, and gave Noah and the earth the rainbow as a sign of that covenant promise. But man would soon turn back to sin in an effort to make a name for himself at the Tower of Babel, where we see the introduction of other gods. So God scattered them among the nations to begin a new nation for himself. Our fourth covenant is called the Abrahamic Covenant. The key word here is the word restore. In Genesis 12, 1, 2, and 3, God chooses one man through whom he will restore his people to himself, Abraham. And in that covenant, God promises him three things. In verse 1, he promises him land. In verse 2, he promises him a people. And in verse 3, he promises him blessing. The land was Israel. The people were the Jews. And the blessing is they will be the touchstone of God towards all the people of every nation to know of him through them, to bless those who bless you and to curse those who curse you. And God made good on his promise too, because as the nation grew greatly, Egypt enslaved them, and God saw their affliction and cursed Egypt greatly through Moses and brought them safely out in the Exodus. Our fifth covenant is called the Mosaic Covenant. Key word here is the word reveal. Now that Israel had grown into a great multitude of people, God brought them to Mount Sinai to make a covenant. This covenant was to serve as a temporary supervisor, teaching the righteous standards of God and reveal man's sin until the coming of Christ. In Leviticus 26, God tells Israel in verse 1, have no other gods. Verse 2, keep the Sabbath. Verse 3, keep his laws and commandments. So while the first four covenants were only up to God, the Mosaic Covenant has conditions for man. And through those conditions, man will have his sin revealed, and he will see the need for a sacrifice. The Mosaic Covenant was temporary until Christ fulfilled every requirement of it, living perfectly and dying as the perfect sacrifice for the sins of all who believed. The sixth covenant is called the Palestinian Covenant. Its key word is return. Well, the old guys died, and the young guys forgot the Mosaic Covenant and didn't keep God's laws. So in Deuteronomy 29, God tells them that they will not keep his covenant, and in Deuteronomy 30, verse 2 and 3, he tells them, come back to me, because when they do, and verse 4 and 5 reminds them of what God promised in the Abrahamic Covenant, land, seed, and blessing. In verse 6, something more, a new heart, which hasn't happened yet until Christ returns and gathers them to a new land. The seventh covenant is called the Davidic Covenant. The key word here is the word reign. After 500 years of judges chaotically administering God's law, God appointed a king named David. King David loved the Lord with all of his heart, and in 2 Samuel 7, 12 through 16, God makes a covenant with David that he will give David's son Solomon three things. Number 1, a throne. Number 2, a house. And number 3, a kingdom forever. After David died, Solomon received the benefit of this covenant with the most prosperous kingdom in Israel's history. But the covenant promise was forever, and Solomon eventually died. So this covenant had a second meaning, to reveal David's greater son of another nature, Jesus Christ, who would be from David's royal line 490 years later. The eighth covenant was called the New Covenant. Key word here is the word regenerate. After David and after many evil kings in Israel and Judah, God sends Israel into exile under Babylon. But before he does, he promises them in Jeremiah chapter 31, verse 27 through verse 34, that he will bring them back one day and give them, and God invents a term here, he will give them a new covenant. In verse 32, God says they have been like babies needing their hand held. But in verse 33, one day they will be sons with new hearts. Like a Jewish boy going through bar mitzvah, becoming a man. This is Israel's bar mitzvah. The law was for babies, teaching them about their sin. Grace is for sons of God, with the law written on their hearts. John the Baptist said, behold, the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. It hasn't happened to Israel yet, but Jesus spoke of this new covenant at the Last Supper for the church as we were grafted in. So we got their king and their covenant. And in verse 34, God will forgive everything they've done. The Christian's purpose doesn't cast aside Israel. but makes Israel jealous until the second coming of Jesus, when all the covenants will be fulfilled and God's purpose from the very beginning for his children to rule and enjoy him forever will be accomplished once and for all. And those, ladies and gentlemen, are the covenants of God.
Oh, did anyone not see that?
We could hear it, but we couldn't see it.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm not
No,
sure
the sound came through fine. The sound came through fine.
Yeah, I must not have shared my screen properly. I apologize for that. So basically, we have last week we talked about the three first, the Noah, Abraham, and Moses, and that then he introduced some new ones and also introduced David and the new covenant. And with the covenant with David, even after God's covenants with Noah and Abraham, and 500 years after a series of judges, and the people still were sinning in Israel and disobeyed the laws. And so the people, when they entered the promised land, they were asking for a king, so they could be like other nations. And so who was the king that they first had? Does anyone remember? Saul. Okay, Saul was from the tribe of Benjamin. And so, but he failed to obey God, and so he was rejected as a king. And so God then appointed David as king. And David was the son of Jesse and also from the tribe of Judah. And so we know that should really pique our interest, because we know that we're supposed to get a Messiah from the line of Judah. And so as the video mentioned, King David loved the Lord with all his heart. He had become a successful leader, overcoming the enemies and restoring the presence of God in the city of David, or Jerusalem. And when there was finally like a national rest, David decides to build a house for God, but God has other plans. And that's where we get into 2 Samuel 7, 1 through 17. And I don't know if anyone has a Bible. That
2 Samuel what?
2 Samuel chapter 7. Verses 1 through 17.
I got it.
Okay, thanks, Sarah. Can you read that?
Sure. Now, when the king was settled in his house, and the Lord had given him rest from all his enemies around him, the king said to the prophet Nathan, "See now, I am living in a house of cedar, but the ark of God stays in a tent." Nathan said to the king, "Go, do all that you have in mind, for the Lord is with you." But that same night, the word of the Lord came to Nathan. "Go and tell my servant David, thus says the Lord, are you the one to build me a house to live in? I have not lived in a house since the day I brought up the people of Israel from Egypt to this day, but I've been moving about in a tent and a tabernacle. Wherever I have moved about among all the people of Israel, did I ever speak a word with any of the tribal leaders of Israel, whom I commanded to shepherd my people Israel, saying, why have you not built me a house of cedar? Now therefore, thus you shall say to my servant David, thus says the Lord of hosts, I took you from the pasture, from following the sheep, to be prince over my people Israel. And I have been with you wherever you went, and have cut off all your enemies from before you. And I will make for you a great name, like the name of the great ones of the earth. And I will appoint a place for my people Israel, and will plant them, so that they may live in their own place and be disturbed no more. Evildoers shall afflict them no more, as formerly, from the time that I appointed judges over my people Israel. And I will give you rest from all your enemies. Moreover, the Lord declares to you that the Lord will make you a house. When your days are fulfilled and you lie down with your ancestors, I will raise up your offspring after you, who shall come forth from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be a father to him, and he shall be a son to me. When he commits iniquity, I will punish him with a rod such as mortals use, with blows inflicted by human beings. But I will not take my steadfast love from him, as I took it from Saul, whom I put away from before you. Your house and your kingdom shall be made sure forever before me. Your throne shall be established forever. In accordance with all these words and with all this vision, Nathan spoke to David.
Okay. So here, God is promising to give certain things to David, not specifically, but he's kind of referring to giving this to David's lineage or his son Solomon. And so he's kind of promising David's son Solomon three things: the throne, a house or home, a kingdom that will fulfill the promises of the previous covenants, Abraham and Moses, through his children, and a kingdom forever. And so, as the video was speaking of, it's David. After David died, Solomon received the benefits of the covenant. He was the one who actually built the temple for God, the house for God, and but the covenant promises forever, and Solomon eventually would die. And so, as the video stated, so the covenant had a second meaning to reveal David's greater son, Jesus Christ, who would be from his royal line. And they say he was mentioning in the video 490 years later. And so this covenant God makes with David is how God will eventually be the shepherd for the Israelis and for everyone. But there are some stipulations here, that David and his descendants must remain faithful to God and follow the laws, follow the covenant laws. So Israel had to be a nation recognizing God's presence in the temple. God was blessing the Israelites by giving them the kingdom and a perfect king in David. But it also says that there are conditional and unconditional elements to this particular one, because despite the king's failures, God in this covenant guarantees a faithful king on the throne. And we know who he's speaking about there, I believe, with Jesus Christ. Do you have any thoughts about the video or the questions? Any questions about the covenant with David? Nope.
Sometimes I struggle with, that when Christians say, oh, they're talking about Jesus here. And I'm like, I don't know. Yes, maybe God knew, but I don't know. So anyhow,
yeah. I mean, I can get that they're talking about Solomon, but when it says forever, because after Solomon, we have all of the kings weren't fantastic people anymore. You had a lot of evil kings in Israel and Judea, and the kings and the people and even the religious leaders failed. So they were failing again to keep God's commandments.
Well, David was not exactly a
no, he was a
he
was
a very flawed human being like everybody else.
Right. And it says, and that's why I think it says, despite the king's failures, okay, God has guaranteed here that he is going to something good is going to happen with the line of David. You know, your house and your kingdom will endure forever before me. Your throne will be established forever. And if it's not Jesus, who is he talking about?
Well, as Christians, of course, we want it to be Jesus. You know, that's how we interpret it.
Right.
You know, for the Jews at this time, they're still working on trying to get established, you know, get themselves organized and become a lasting civilization, I guess you could say, or a lasting faith.
Yeah.
How were kings elected? You said God made David king. Well, it's not exactly that, you know, God was appearing and said, "Thou shalt be king." How did this happen?
Well, they had, who was the last judge? Samuel, I think. And God told Samuel to go to Jesse's house and to look at Jesse's sons. So God was guiding the judge Samuel to choose David, and then Samuel anointed David king, if I remember correctly.
So there was God's involvement
Yeah.
in that process.
Yes.
And then from David, then it became an inherited position, I guess.
Okay.
Well, and even after David, like we said, there were the covenant was not being kept by the Jewish people. And it turns out that they were all covenant breakers. You know, the Jewish people that God had selected through Abraham and down the line, you know, were just habitual. All of us are habitual covenant breakers. You know,
I was going to say,
built into us, you know. And so God then sends Israel into exile under Babylon because they haven't kept their covenant. But before he does, the prophets give us some hope that God would one day bring about a new covenant, and that is, the place in the Old Testament where it mentions the new covenant is in Jeremiah. And I don't know if someone has Jeremiah 31, chapter 31. If not, I have it here.
it takes me a minute because mine 1294. Jeremiah 31.
Verses 31 through 34.
Jeremiah comes after Isaiah. Jeremiah 31. All right, I'm in Jeremiah. All right, what verses?
31 through 34.
Oh yeah, because Yahweh talks a whole lot in this chapter. All right, 31 through 34. Look, the days are coming, and this is titled the New Covenant in my Bible. Look, the days are coming, Yahweh declares, when I shall make a new covenant with the house of Israel. And then in parentheses, it says, and the house of Judah, but not like the covenant I made with their ancestors the day I took them by the hand to bring them out of Egypt, a covenant which they broke, even though I was their master, Yahweh declares. No, this is the covenant I shall make with the house of Israel when those days have come, Yahweh declares. Within them I shall plant my law, writing it on their hearts. Then I shall be their God, and they will be my people. There will be no further need for everyone to teach neighbor or brother, saying, learn to know Yahweh. No, they will all know me. From the least to the greatest, Yahweh declares, since I shall forgive their guilt and never more call their sin to mind. Hmm.
This is the only reference in the Hebrew Bible, it said, that actually uses the word new covenant. When I will make a new covenant with the people of Israel. Now that's when they come back, when they're sent to exile now. But this is hope that they will come back and there will be a new covenant with them. And he promises them that he will bring them back one day and give them the new covenant. He says where they've been like babies before, and he's had to hold their hand. And one day they will be sons with new hearts, like going through the bar mitzvah, in a Jewish man's life when you become a man. It says that this is Israel's. One of the commentators says this is Israel's bar mitzvah, that the law is for babies. Okay. Teaching them about their sin, but grace is for sons of God with the new law written on their hearts. In this particular quote in the New Testament, it said that the full quotation is used in the New Testament, kind of reflects that the New Testament authors generally consider this to be the central Old Testament prophecy about the new covenant with Jesus. And if we take a look at Hebrews, in Hebrews, they actually quote this verbatim, Jeremiah verbatim, in these passages that Kathy just read in there.
It's interesting that also in Jeremiah 33, verse 14, mine says, "The day will come, says the Lord, when I will do for Israel and Judah all the good I have promised them. At that time, I will bring to the throne of David a righteous descendant, and he will do what is right, what is just and right throughout the land. In that day, Judah will be saved, Jerusalem will live in safety, and their motto will be, the Lord is our righteousness. For this is what the Lord says, David will forever have a descendant sitting on the throne of Israel."
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And in the New Testament, it talks about in Hebrews, and I'll read this from Hebrews 8:1-13. It says, "Now the main point of what we are saying is this: we do have a high priest who sat down at the right hand of the throne of majesty in heaven, and who serves in the sanctuary, the true tabernacle set up by the Lord, not merely by human being. Every high priest is appointed to offer both gifts and sacrifices, and so it was necessary for this one also to have something to offer. If he were on earth, he would not be a priest, for there are already priests who offer gifts prescribed by the law. They serve in a sanctuary that is a copy and shadow of what is in heaven. This is why Moses was warned when he was about to build the tabernacle, see to it that you make everything according to the pattern shown you on the mountain. But in fact, the ministry Jesus has received is superior to theirs, as the covenant of which he is mediator is superior to the old one, since the new covenant is established on better promises. For if there had been nothing wrong with the first covenant, no place would have been sought for another. But God found fault with the people and said," and then they list what Jeremiah, the quote that we just read from Jeremiah, completely. And they follow that up with, "By calling this covenant new, he has made the first one obsolete, and what is obsolete and outdated will soon disappear." And so the new covenant is kind of the culmination of God's saving work with the people. He promises to make an everlasting covenant with his people. He writes it on their hearts. He brings complete forgiveness of sin. And he puts the Spirit in them to empower them to love and obey his commandments. So it's a whole series of things. And we talk about signs for this new covenant. And they talk about the sign is Jesus and the new covenant that Jesus brings. So that when Jesus came, it was kind of the sign that God is fulfilling the new covenant mentioned in Jeremiah.
It's other than being a bullfrog, Jeremiah, if you remember, was with them in Babylon, and this whole thing of being in exile brought a lot of thought of what's going on. They were taken by the Babylonians. I think they were there about 80 years, and the old. They would question the old, covenant, I would think, at this point. And so it's timely for Jeremiah to say, well, we're going to get a new one. And then, of course, he's the one that took all the Hebrews back to Israel, with the aid of, if you remember, the Persians came in and beat the Babylonians, and the Persian king let Jeremiah take all the Hebrews back to Israel, if I've got it right from memory. It's a great setup for a new covenant. You're in exile for all these years. Everything's been taken away from you. Now a new covenant, and get to go back home. It's kind of a perfect setup for getting rid of the old one that didn't work because we were in exile, and now we're going back home and create something new.
I forget, Harold, what was the wasn't the exile supposed to last for X number of years, and then because the Jewish people hadn't changed, they were still being as bad as they always were, that God extended it?
I don't remember. I think it was about 80 years that they were there, I think. But again, my history, I haven't looked at that history for a long time. But I remember it was only the Persians, which is so interesting. Now, Persia now being Iran saved Israel. Yeah. But that's when they got to go back home, only through the Persian, defeat of Babylonia. So, if you think about it, you're in 80 years, if that's correct, is a long time, and to be wondering what in the world, why did God forget us? So this message of a new covenant is timely and probably fell on ears that were ready to hear it.
Mm-hmm.
And again, if I may have, you all taught me that a long time ago. So, if I remember it correctly.
Oh, it wasn't us.
Yeah, it was.
You're teaching it to me.
It was.
I think you've remembered it pretty accurately.
And
Well, see, I have good teachers.
Thank you, Harold.
yeah, they talk about the before, like with Noah, where we had the sign of the rainbow being the sign of the new covenant. They were looking for what signs of the new covenant do we see in the life of Jesus. And they talk about in Matthew and in Luke, Jesus connects his death to the new Exodus or a new covenant themes that are mentioned in Jeremiah and also Isaiah. And it says, like in Matthew 26 through 29, if we remember, while they were eating, Jesus took the bread. And when he had given thanks, he broke it and gave it to his disciples, saying, "Take, eat, this is my body." Then he took the cup, and when he had given thanks, he gave it to them, saying, Drink from it, all of you. It is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. I tell you, I will not drink of this cup and fruit of the vine until I drink it with my Father in my Father's kingdom. And then in Luke, it also mentions taking the bread. This is my body. And in the same way, after supper, he took the cup. This is the cup of the new covenant in my blood, which is poured out for you. But the hand of him who is going to betray me, and talking about Judas. So Jesus actually just mentioning the new covenant, with the signs or the symbols that we use now to remember that new covenant. We do every Sunday in church, in our church, with the communion.
So remember last week we were talking about the covenant with Moses, and that after the 10 Commandments and the law had been given on Mount Sinai, Moses and Aaron and the elders went back and had, this is how it's related in Deuteronomy, and had the meal. And there was reference there to the blood, because, what struck me about, where Jesus at the Last Supper says, this is the covenant, this is the new covenant. He doesn't go on and expound on it like it does in the Old Testament, as far as what you got to do and what you're going to get. The Old Testament spells that out. Here he just says, this is the cup of the new covenant.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Gil reminds us he's been teaching them for 3 years, so he didn't feel like he had to go over it again, I guess.
Touche, Gail. Good point. Yeah, that we were supposed to know it.
Right. So,
right, because it's in Exodus, not Deuteronomy, it's Exodus. Because it's Moses. Moses then took the blood and sprinkled it over the people, saying, "This is the blood of the covenant which God has made with you," entailing all these stipulations. So,
yeah. And
so thank goodness that's not a ritual that we reenact.
right. It's in the Interpreter's Bible. There's a definition of new covenant: a promise of redemption by God to people as individuals rather than as a nation, and on the basis of God's grace rather than a person's adherence to the law.
All right, read that again.
The new covenant definition is a promise of redemption by God to people as individuals rather than as a nation, and on the basis of God's grace rather than a person's adherence to the law. So Christ, it mentioned in the last passage that we read that Christ, or one of the passages we read today, Christ is the mediator of this new covenant.
Mm-hmm.
That and in Hebrews 7, I'll read this 22 through 28. It says, because of this oath, Jesus has become the guarantor. Okay, talking about a legal agreement or whatever, guarantor of a better covenant. Now there have been many of those priests since death prevented them from continuing in office, but because Jesus lives forever, he has permanent priesthood. There he is able to save completely those who come to God through him, because he always lives to receive them. Such a high priest truly meets our need, one who is holy, blameless, pure, set apart from sinners, exalted above the heavens. Unlike the other high priests, he does not need to offer sacrifices day after day for his own sins and then for the sins of people. He sacrificed for their sins once for all when he offered himself. For the law anoints as high priests men in all their weakness, but the oath which came after the law appointed the Son, who has been made perfect forever. So the New Testament basically is presenting Jesus as an offspring of Abraham who trusted his father even to the point of death, and so became a blessing to all nations, that he was the obedient Israelite, the Moses covenant, who perfectly kept, fulfilled, and transcended the law of God. And he is the royal son of David, who has inaugurated God's kingdom in life, death, and resurrection, and now sits at God's right hand, reigning as shepherd king over the earth, and will continue to reign forever over the new creation. So Jesus, if we think about it, Jesus has succeeded where has succeeded at every point where we always failed in his life. And there's also I think we have a few minutes. There's also another area in Hebrews where it talks about the blood of Christ. And I'll read that. But when Christ became high priest of the good things that are already here, he went through the greater and more perfect tabernacle that is not made with human hands. That is to say, is not a part of this creation. He did not enter by means of the blood of goats and calves, but he entered the most holy place once for all by his own blood, thus obtaining eternal redemption. The blood of goats and bulls and ashes of a heifer sprinkled on those who are ceremoniously unclean sanctify them so that they are outwardly clean. How much more then will the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself unblemished to God, cleanse our consciences from acts that lead to death, so that we may serve the living God. For this reason, Christ is the mediator of a new covenant, that those who are called may receive the promised eternal inheritance, now that he has died as a ransom to set them free from the sins committed under the first covenant. So it's taking it all the way back to the first covenants within Eden or with Adam. In the case of a will, it goes on, it is necessary to prove the death of the one who made it, because a will is enforced only when someone has died. It never takes effect while one who has made while the one who made it is living. This is why even the first covenant was not put to effect without blood. When Moses proclaimed every command of the law to all the people, he took the blood of calves, together with water, scarlet wool, and branches of hyssop, and sprinkled the scroll and all the people. He said, "This is the blood of the covenant which God has commanded you keep." In the same way, he sprinkled with the blood both the tabernacle and everything used in its ceremonies. In fact, the law requires that nearly everything be cleansed with blood, and without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness. It was necessary then for the copies of the heavenly things to be purified with these sacrifices. The heavenly things themselves are better sacrifices than these. For Christ did not enter a sanctuary made with human hands that was only a copy of the true one. He entered heaven itself, now to appear for us in God's presence. Nor did he enter heaven to offer himself again and again, the way high priests enter the most holy place every year with blood that is not his own. Otherwise, Christ would have had to suffer many times since the creation of the world, but he has appeared once for all at the culmination of the ages to do away with sin by the sacrifice of himself. Just as people are destined to die once and after that to face judgment, so Christ was sacrificed once to take away the sins of many, and he will appear a second time, not to bear sin, but to bring salvation to those who are waiting for him.
Hebrews was written quite, 300-400 years later, 300 years later.
Oh, I don't think it was that late. It
Wasn't
was,
that long?
Wasn't that long.
All right.
No.
Well, the reason I'm wondering if that's had enough time for them to begin creating a new doctrine within the Christian church. Find me in what Christ said, where he said, I am the sacrifice for the forgiveness of sins. Never did he say that. He said other things about what was going on. But if we're truly going to study what Christ said, I think we need to really watch putting words in his mouth, putting new, all these new things in place that Christ never talked about.
Yeah, I think that would be a good thing to study, is all the different ways of looking at why Christ died and why he had to die. And the various opinions on that. There is a really cute, or not cute, but a nice video on, I don't know if any of you have watched videos with know about the Bible Project. But if you just go online and look at the Bible Project, they have a lot of interesting videos, blogs, podcasts, and there's one video on sacrifice and atonement that I was going to play today, but we don't have enough time, that you might want to look at as a follow-up to this, and see what you think about that.
And I just to sort of follow up, Harold, with what you were saying, that in the early church, I mean, they didn't have mass communication, and things were not necessarily consistent across all the Christians. There was something I read the other day that even up until like 500 AD, there were some Christian churches that if you went to worship there, you wouldn't know whether you were at a synagogue or at a church. That not everybody worshiped the same way. Not everybody interpreted the scriptures the same way then or now.
I understand there was, especially in the early church, but I'm just saying, show me in the New Testament, show me where things that Christ said, which the four Gospels, show me where he said, I am the sacrificial lamb, and only through my sacrifice can there be forgiveness, it's not there, I don't think. And I have had some really wonderful teachers, but I don't think it's there. He does say other things about the whole deal, but I think this sacrificial lamb came in later because people are trying to figure out why.
There are so many ties to the sacrifice and the blood with the Last Supper, with what Jesus was doing, maybe not what was actually in red letters, but what was happening.
Well, but I'll refer you, I think it's John 6:50, where Christ explains the whole concept of the blood and and it's not exactly the way we have brought it forward. I think, and it's good, I think that's right, John 6:50, that he's trying to explain the whole concept of what the blood meant and It's maybe not literal, but again, I haven't looked this stuff up in a little bit, but maybe wrong on that.
Yeah.
I'm just saying, if we're going to study Christ.
Well, that's what we're studying for, is to try to look at and see.
I know, that's what I'm saying. I'm just always leery of what other people are saying about what Christ said versus what Christ said. And, when we have so many scholars and so many theologians.
Well, one thing that I would like for you all to think about, and maybe we can bring it up at some time in the future, is if God were on this call, okay, if one of these little boxes showed up and it said God there, what question would you ask? What kind of question would you like to ask God? All the study that we've done, everything, because I thought we might take some of those questions that you might have for God and do a little research and see if we could figure out, what would God, how would God answer that? And whether we talk with Cindy and David and different people to see how would God answer this question?
You would say, don't overthink it.
Don't overthink it.
Well, in my house, I can tell you that my box has God's name on it.
Yeah,
It says Gail Graham, doesn't it? Or Gail Campbell, right?
yeah.
In my house, that's what goes. That's,
Yay.
Think about that. What question would you ask God? And it's
Why me, Lord?
Why me, Lord? Oh, we know why you, Bernie. It's 10:54, so we need to end this and get to church.
Thank you, Susan.
Maybe God will answer our questions in church.